Hello, everyone, and welcome. Good morning. In this session, I'll be talking about some of our research that we performed on a couple of connected medical devices, and we'll also be presenting our findings that we discovered as part of our research. But before I start, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to one of my colleagues, Nick Jaliski, who also heavily contributed to this research, but then decided to go to Costa Rica. I also want to thank Black Hat for this opportunity to present. Although I've spoken at conferences before, this is my first Black Hat talk ever, so it's a bit intimidating. And although you can't see, my legs are shaking, I'm a bit nervous, so I won't be making any eye contacts. Right, so my name is Saurabh Harit. I'm a managing consultant at Spirent Security Labs, which is part of Spirent Communications. I've been a penetration tester, a red teamer for over a decade now. As a result, I'm domain admin at a lot of places. I'm also a security researcher. I'm not much of a speaker, but I've spoken at conferences and trained at various conferences as well. I like to think of myself as a wannabe reverse engineer because I started my career as a reverse engineer, but I don't get to do reverse engineering as often. So I jump on a chance to do reverse engineering when I get a chance. I also wrote a tool called Yasuo, which basically scans for third-party vulnerable applications, can be downloaded from GitHub. Nothing too fancy there. Right, so I'll start with the introduction to connected healthcare devices, so what they are. We'll take a look at their workflow and the architecture of these devices. Then we'll jump into some of the benefits of having connected medical devices, followed by some of the challenges that are presented by these devices. And then we'll talk about some of the horror stories that are associated with these connected medical devices. I'll touch upon medical records and financial data because it's important to understand how the paradigm is shifting from in these two data types. We'll talk about some of the threat surfaces that are exposed by these connected medical devices, especially from a penetration tester's perspective. And then after that, we'll jump onto the two case studies, which will present our findings of the research that we performed, followed by the closing remarks. Don't want to be a spoil sport, but I wanted to have a disclaimer up here. Because the devices that we're going to be talking about are heavily deployed and at different medical institutions, they deal with typical and real-world patient data. I won't be disclosing the name of any of the manufacturers, naming the devices, etc. I also apologize for heavily redacted screenshots. I think they put classified documents to shame. But the idea of this research was purely educational and not to bash anyone. Right, so what are connected medical healthcare devices? Simply, they are just the medical devices that are connected. So they could be connected to each other. They could be connected to a private network, like a user's home. They could be connected to cloud. They could be connected to a hospital's private network. And these devices can talk on a lot of protocols. So they can talk over Wi-Fi, cellular data, so 3G, 4G, LTE. They can talk different protocols like Zigbee, Z-Wave, etc. So, for example, your Apple Watch talks to your iPhone over Bluetooth, or say, for example, if you have a Fitbit weighing scale that can connect to the cloud infrastructure and share data with it over Wi-Fi, an insulin pump or an infusion pump in a private hospital connects over Wi-Fi or wired connection, so on and so forth. And so IoT devices in general have blown up in past. So we've seen tons of these devices come out in past few years. And while I clearly understand the benefits of some of these devices, for example, I can see why there's a need for connected medical devices. I can see why there's a need for connected automobiles, or maybe not. But there are some other IoT devices that I just can't get behind or can't get excited about. So, for example, your internet-connected washing machine or your internet-connected toaster, right? So let's just think about it for a second. I've got an internet-connected washing machine here. Okay, I still have to take my dirty laundry all the way to the machine and dump the damn thing in there. And at that moment, I have to make a decision. Either I can just click that big red blinking start button right then and there, or I can run down to my basement, log into my laptop, connect to it over Wi-Fi, and then start it that way. And then, since I'm an idiot, and I'm sitting there and wondering, did it even work? So I'll run back upstairs and then check on it if it worked or not. So it's a tough choice. But while I don't understand the clear benefits of having these devices connected to the internet, there are definite risks that are associated with it. So first and foremost is someone can break into these devices and then use them to pivot to your internal home network. So they can use these devices to attack other devices on your home network, which is never fun. All right. So I really hate to throw out numbers, so I won't. Some of the sources predict that the connected IoT devices would be 6 billion by 2020. Others predict that that number would be 20 billion. And so the stats were all over the place, so I didn't bring them in. But these connected medical devices can be loosely categorized into these 5 categories. And number 1 is consumer wearables, and pretty much everyone in this room would be more familiar with this category of devices. So these include your fitness trackers, your activity trackers, sleep pattern monitors, and so on. Then there are patient monitoring devices, which comprise of insulin pumps, your BP monitors, which is a blood pressure monitor, ECG, glucose meters, and so on. There are IVD, which are also called in vitro or in vitro devices. There are like HIV detection systems, your blood analyzers, etc. And then all these devices that we have talked about so far, they are external to your body. And then there are other medical devices which are implanted into a human's body, and the most common example I can think of is a pacemaker. Other than that, there are in-house equipments, and these are usually the bulky on-wheel machines that you see in hospitals, so your X-ray machines, ultrasound machines, MRI, etc. Some of them are new, so they have the connection part built into them. Some of them use some other ways to connect to the network, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So when I was doing this research, from my perspective, this is what an information loop of a typical medical IoT device looks like. And I'll explain it with example of a simple insulin pump. Right? So at rest, the device is always in a monitoring mode, so it monitors, say, for example, your insulin level, your blood pressure, etc., using sensors. And that data is then passed on to something called an event architecture. And what event architecture module does is that it constantly analyzes that data, and if it sees a deviation from any normality, then it can create alerts or trigger an alert, and that using the on-chip board, and then that can create an action. So action could be injecting appropriate amount of insulin in a human's body. After that is done, that data is aggregated, so it could be sent to a hospital's private network over VPN. It could be sent to a cloud infrastructure or simply stored on the device. And this data aggregation part and the next step, which is data analysis, is one of the most important parts. At least they're going to be more important in near future. And so the analysis could be analyzed data could be consumed by security researchers, device manufacturers, medical practitioners, and general practitioners as well. All right. This is what a typical ecosystem of a connected medical device looks like. So on far right side of me, so there could be a medical device that could be connected to a hospital's private network. Or there could be a medical device that simply is just on its own. So it could be on a cellular network, and these are the devices like my own portable insulin pump, etc. So when the device is on connected to the hospital network, it may use wireless or Ethernet to connect to a hospital's private network. And at that point of time, it would have access to other subsystems within that medical institution. So, for example, an infusion pump can talk to a pump server. There could be a database on the system where it retrieves data from and then stores back data. And if the hospital or medical institution chooses to share that data with other medical institutions or researchers, then the data can break out using the enterprise gateway and then get stored on a cloud server where others can access it. Or the hospital could also choose to store that data on premises and then allow access to other researchers and medical institutions to that data through VPN. And then, like I mentioned, there are devices. For example, if I have my own insulin pump, it will most likely be on home network. And then it can directly talk to the cloud server, either using cellular data or wireless data. Here I've tried to create an architecture of a connected medical device. And so there are three major layers to it. The first one on the far right side is the medical device itself. And so the medical device has various subsystems to it. So once again, it can talk on various protocols. So I've listed only some of them there. So IRDA, which is Infrared Device Association, Zigbee, Z-Wave, RFID, wireless, Wi-Fi, 3G, 4G, LTE. Other than that, it usually has a sensor and an actuator, so to monitor heart rate, blood pressure, etc. There would be a display which would allow user to monitor statistics or to change statistics and so forth, and so on. It would have a small storage to store the gathered data, usually the data that is gathered through the sensors. It might have a location tracker, especially the devices that track your steps, track your location, and so on. Then, as I mentioned before, there's an event architecture module, and it just takes data from the sensors and then analyzes that data and performs action based on that particular data. Then there's a device association part of it, and this particular module is pretty important from security perspective, and we'll talk about it later in this presentation. And so it handles your authentication, authorization, just the whole way of associating a device in a secure manner, either directly to cloud or to a private hospital network, etc. Now, there's also a command and control, which we all love. So command and control can be used to remote into the device, either for the purpose of troubleshooting or for remotely upgrading firmware, making changes, and so on. And then on top of that, there is the middle-ware. So think of middle-ware as your web server, for what a web server would be for a web application. So this handles all the server-side logic for your IoT device. So it will handle most part of authentication, authorization, association. So all that code would be on the middleware. And then more importantly, it has storage. So it aggregates data from all these devices and then stores that data. And then on top of that, it performs some strong data analytics on this data. And so it augments the data and then outputs a consumable set of data, which can then be consumed by researchers, medical practitioners, etc. It also exposes a few APIs, so application programming interfaces, which can then feed into a web portal where, say, for example, your physician could log in and then gain access to patient data. Researchers could log in for further analysis. Even device manufacturers could log in to gather data about the devices and how they're functioning. Right. So why do we need connected medical devices, or why are we connecting these devices to the network? And so first and foremost, it allows for remote health monitoring. So your doctors can view patient data or monitor your stats remotely in real time. And it's got some of the obvious benefits. So first one would be that since doctors can remotely view this data, a patient won't have to go to a medical institution as often. So that cuts down cost on part of the patient. It also cuts down cost on the hospital side of it. And again, more importantly, it helps with managing workload of medical practitioners. So your doctors, your nurses, they're often overworked. So it takes care of that part as well. Also, since doctors can now view your data in real time remotely, they can also provide a faster healthcare. So, for example, they can adjust dosage on your insulin pump remotely, so you get more customized care and more faster care. Global healthcare is one field which can really benefit from connected medical devices. There isn't much happening in this field right now, but going in future, it could be really crucial. So think of underdeveloped or third world countries. They don't have as much medical support staff, so connected medical devices can really help there. When it comes to asset management, since most of these devices connect to a central system, it becomes very easy to maintain these devices, troubleshoot these devices, update these devices. So you can monitor signs of malfunctioning at an early stage and fix those devices. Then there are alerts. So a connected medical device could alert a patient about if there's a deviation from normality. So for example, again, if the insulin level drops, it can alert a patient or either inject insulin into the body, allow patient time to contact the first responders, and so on. Connected medical devices can also remind patients of taking medicine at a certain time, which could be a problem for some patients. And then finally, one of the most important, in my opinion, would be the EHR, which is electronic healthcare records systems and real-time health systems. And so these systems collect data, real-time data from all these connected medical devices. And so EHR, they're not as powerful, so they were never meant to gather data in real time. They were never meant to interact too much with the connected IoT devices. But RTHS is very powerful. It provides very powerful data analytics. And so, again, it takes all this real-time data, which can really be used by a lot of researchers in discerning patterns. They can be used by device manufacturers to see how the devices are functioning, and then use that data for the betterment of the device. Right. So we've talked about some of the benefits. Here I'll just touch upon on some of the challenges that come with the connected medical device. And I think one of the biggest challenge for connected medical device or for medical institutions and health institutions would be to support these large and growing number of connected medical devices. So there are already tons of connected medical devices per bed in hospitals. And if you combine that with portable medical devices that patients will start to bring with themselves. For example, if I am diabetic, I could buy an insulin pump and then take that to my medical institution and then tell them to associate it with the hospital network. So hospitals will have to make sure that they have enough bandwidth to support all these devices so that their wireless or wired infrastructure does not choke when all these devices connect. Second would be interoperability. So a lot of these devices are manufactured by tons of manufacturers. They can talk on different protocols. They might have different data format and request format. And so it'll be a challenge to get these devices to talk to each other. Then there is authentication and authorization itself. So how do you differentiate from a legitimate device from a rogue device? So I can as easily take a rogue device and try to associate it with the hospital network. And if that part is not handled securely, then there could be problems there. Segregation of data could be a big problem because we've already established that there are a lot of malware and ransomware that are trying to target medical devices because of some of the issues that are in there. So keeping these devices on the same network as your hospital billing system could be a problem as well. And then patching. So you can think of these medical devices as industrial control systems. Actually, in a way, they are industrial control systems. And so a lot of them come with old hardware. They have older operating systems, just the way that they work around the clock. It's not easy to patch them. In fact, most of these devices are heavily and strictly maintained by the manufacturer's own technicians. So even if hospital staff, IT staff wanted to do something about it, they don't have much insight into these medical devices. They don't have any protection against malware, etc. And then some of the most common vulnerabilities that we have discovered in these devices are your default password, the hard-coded passwords in firmware, insecure or plain text data during transmission or storage, etc. So just the common vulnerabilities that we have already seen before. And finally, then there are medical devices that were never meant to be connected to the network. So these are your legacy devices that really had older firmware. They've been around forever, but just because they have a large lifespan, they are now being connected to the network. And the way these devices are being connected to the network also presents a huge risk, and I'll talk about it in the next slide. After I have some water. So, like I just mentioned, a lot of these devices, which are older, like your ECG machines, your MRI machines, they are now connected to the network. And so since they are legacy devices, they were never meant to be connected to the network, and the way they are connected are using a hardware called a serial to Ethernet converter. And using serial to Ethernet converter is just generally a bad idea, because those devices, small hardware, they are just they're plagued with vulnerabilities. In fact, Department of U.S. Homeland Security created an alert against one of the most common and most popularly sold serial to Ethernet converter device called Nport. It's developed by a Taiwanese company called Moxa. Yes, Moxa. I always get it wrong. And so there were several vulnerabilities that were discovered and reported in this particular piece of hardware. One was that it allowed remote attackers to remotely break into the device and retrieve sensitive information without providing any authentication. The other one was that an attacker could again remotely connect to the device and upgrade or downgrade firmware of the device itself without any authentication. And then there was a third one that allowed attackers to remotely execute malicious code on these devices simply by connecting to them remotely and without providing any authentication, because there was a buffer overflow vulnerability in these devices. Right. And other than that, like if you forget about these critical vulnerabilities, these devices, which are Ethernet to serial to Ethernet converters, they typically operate at 10 megabyte per second link. So if there is another host on the network which operates on, say, 1 gigabyte per second, and someone is able to, somehow that particular host went rogue, that alone can exhaust your Ethernet, this adapter, by sending large number of packets, making it unresponsive, and just simply creating denial of service against these devices. So if you remember, some of you might remember, in 2015, there was a large attack on Ukraine's electrical infrastructure. There was unscheduled power outage that happened. And again, as per Department of Homeland Security, what happened was the attackers were able to remotely corrupt the firmware of one of these serial to Ethernet converters, which caused the outage. So yeah, generally it's always a bad idea to use these devices, and if you really, really must, just make sure that you secure and lock down the whole infrastructure. Right, attack surface, I'll just quickly touch upon it. So the IoT device, it could be like as small as this device to like a huge device, and they look like simple devices, but if you break it down, so an IoT device would have a network layer, it would have an application layer, it would have probably have a mobile interface, then there's hardware itself, there's cloud infrastructure, so there's whole support system. And so now when you think of attacks against each and every layer of these at these layers, so there could be attacks against network layer, application layer, device hardware, mobile interface, cloud infrastructure. So, and take all these attacks and then combine them together. That is what the attack surface of an IoT device would be. So it could look like a simple device, but it does expose a huge attack surface. Right. So while there are many horror stories that are associated with, Right. So while there are many horror stories, actually, so I don't care if it fits or not. I just wanted to have Idris Elba on my slide somehow. So while there are many horror stories associated with medical devices, connected medical devices, from ransomware to malware, I specifically wanted to talk about MedJack because of all the attention it got and all the damage it caused. So MedJack, or medical device hijack, is a malware that first came out in 2015. It lived through most of 2016. And then MedJack 2 was a more sophisticated, evolved version of MedJack, and most of you would have heard about it. And so interestingly, MedJack only targeted older operating systems. Right? So it didn't go for new operating systems. It only went after the older operating systems like Windows XP, Windows 2K, Windows 2K3, etc. It also specifically targeted tried to exploit the older vulnerabilities. So vulnerabilities like MS-08067, which was released in 2008. And so one of the important thing about MedJack was that it went undetected by a lot of endpoint solutions. And so why that happened was because MedJack was only targeting older operating systems and older outdated vulnerabilities. When that malicious packet reached the modern operating system, they were already patched against it. So they simply ignored the packet. It didn't even reach the endpoint solution. And so it was stealthy, and it was able to compromise a lot of medical devices that had older operating systems. And older operating systems don't have any protection against malware. They don't have an security endpoint solution, so they didn't report the malicious activity as well. So it went completely undetected, and I think once it compromised these medical devices, it started to use them as pivot point to attack further machines on the network. So I think it also utilized Citadel and Zeus malware to move laterally onto the network, which goes to say that once someone is on the internal network, it becomes very easy. There are a lot of other opportunities that open up to compromise further infrastructure and exfiltrate data. Let's quickly talk about financial versus medical data. So a typical medical health record comprises of your first name, last name, billing information, address, phone number, health record number, policy number, etc. And this data is rapidly gaining value in the black market. In fact, medical health records are almost 10 times more costlier than your credit card numbers on black market these days. And so the reason why it's happening is because of low and slow detection rate. So all the financial institutions, the algorithms that they use, those have really matured fast, so they can easily detect a credit card theft and block it, while a stolen medical health record can go undetected for months, if not years. And so the perpetuators can steal this data and then use it to create fake identities, and then they use these fake identities to buy medical equipment, to buy drugs, which are then sold on the black market. So if you look at, a lot of companies release their annual security report every year. So if you look at that, the attacks on the financial data have actually gone down by almost 30%, especially in Europe. And it could be because of introduction of EMV standards. But as a result, the attackers are looking for other avenues, and medical data is very lucrative to them. All right, so we have covered all the made-up data. So we can jump on to the case studies now. This is the first device that we looked at. So it was essentially a digital pen. Basically, doctors use it to write prescription, which is then electronically transferred to the pharmacies, so patients can directly go to the pharmacies, get their medicine. This particular device is manufactured by, there are tons of manufacturers that manufacture these devices. We only looked at one of them. And this is just a random image from the internet. In fact, most of the images in here are random from the internet. They don't mean anything. Right. So I've tried to create the workflow for that particular device. So it would typically be on a hospital network. It'll be connected to the hospital's private network using wireless or Ethernet. And then once it captures data or the prescription, it breaks out to the internet using hospital's enterprise gateway. And then that data is stored on the cloud. So there's cloud infrastructure, there's an application server, there's a database server. They also expose a web portal. So your pharmacists, your doctors, even patients can log in. They all have their own accounts. And then there's segregation of data there, so they can all log into the portal and then gain access to their data. Right, so it came with Windows 10 installed. So there were two default accounts that we saw. One was a nurse/physician, which was to be used by medical practitioners, and then there was an administrator account, which basically allowed manufacturers to remote into the device to perform remote operations. It exposed USB port. It had capability to connect over wireless and Ethernet. It had an HDMI VGA port for display. It had a digital display itself, an audio port. It came with Windows Defender, fully updated. It had a docking station, so to dock the pen, and the software layer itself. So there were some manufacturer applications, which were the digital pen applications and services that we saw that were running on these devices. Right, so a typical use case scenario for this digital pen would be that it will be at a nurse's station in a hospital, and when doctors go to visit a patient and they need to write a prescription, they will use one of these pens to write a prescription on a special paper, and then that prescription is digitally transferred to the pharmacy. So some of the benefits would be that your data is instantly sent, prescription is instantly sent to the pharmacies, and when you so that cuts down time. So when you go to the pharmacist, your prescription is ready for pickup. So essentially, it's just a glorified fax machine. Think of it this way. Right, so there were some initial observations. Since it had this VGA and USB ports and HDMI port, we could connect a monitor to it. In a default setting, there isn't a monitor connected to it, except for the small touchpad display it has. When you boot up the pen, it automatically logs into the nurse or physician's account. It's a lockdown mode. You can't do much in it. Then we saw some manufacturer applications and services that were running on the system. The data was captured using the USB. When the doctor is writing the prescription, at that point of time, if the pen is connected to the internet, then the data would be transferred to the pharmacy in real time, right then and there. If it's not connected to the internet at that point of time, it encrypts data and then temporarily stores it on the disk. And then when the pen connects back to the internet, then that data is transferred. The data is transferred to the pharmacy systems using SSL. So that part was secure. And then there's a remote access component to it as well. Right, so again, heavily redacted documents. One thing to start with, what we wanted to do was, since we had such a limited access to the pen, obviously we were able to connect a keyboard and monitor to it. We wanted to, first of all, escalate privileges so that we could do more with an operating system. So we started looking at different avenues of escalating our privileges on the network, so on this particular device. And while we couldn't find much, we didn't have any permission to start or stop any services. There were no known vulnerabilities or exploits that worked against it. But we did found one service, which was actually the manufacturer's own service, a digital pen service. And we didn't have permissions to start or stop that particular service, but it allowed us to modify the service binary itself. So typical pen tester stuff, we created our own payload. So we replaced it with the original binary, just renamed the original binary, put it our own binary in there. And again, we didn't have permission to restart the service, so we just rebooted the pen. So when it came back up, it executed our binary instead of the original binary. And so that created a a local admin account on that particular device. So at this point of time, we had administrator access. So we could explore more of the operating systems, look at more files, and then more importantly, install tools that we wanted to. So first of all, we installed Wireshark. So we started to explore network traffic, spent a few hours analyzing that, but there wasn't much in there because all the data was encrypted. After that, we installed Windows system internal utilities. So we installed Procmon. And so Procmon was originally part of the Windows system internal utilities, and it allows you to monitor any process-related, thread-related, any file activity-related, registry-related activities. So file reads, file writes, threads, processes, etc. So we fired up Procmon, and it's a pain because Procmon create tons of messages, tons of events, and logs tons of data when you start looking at that. So it took us a while to go through each and every data. We started to filter out data to make it more effective. And so after a few hours, we realized that the digital pen application often queries a file with file extension .enc and reads that file. So it queries the file, reads some parameters from the file, and then somehow uses them. So we located the file on the operating system, and we tried to open it in a notepad, and it didn't make any sense because the whole file was encrypted. So, like I said, I treat myself as a wannabe reverse engineer, so we started to reverse engineer the application. So I put Ollie debugger in there. It's a system level debugger. Why I used Ollie debugger is because it doesn't require any installation. It's just a standalone binary. So we loaded the digital pen application in there and started doing some dynamic and static reverse engineering. And again, after spending several hours on it, we finally located a function. So this block of function, which is highlighted in red, basically is the code that decrypts that file. So what application does is that it looks at the file. If it finds the file, it loads the file in memory and then uses this logic to decrypt the whole file. Again, it took a few more hours to just reverse engineer the whole logic of decrypting the file. Essentially, I wrote a Python script that would just locate the file and then decrypt the file so that we can view the contents of the file. Right, so when we were able to read the file eventually, we found that it contains some data, but more importantly, it had a database connection string to it. And so like it contained the IP address of a MySQL database, it contained the username, it contained the password. And then you can see that the username was root, which is the highest privileged user on a MySQL database. So basically allowed us complete access to the database. And so we're like, okay, so maybe this is redundant data because a lot of times it's like a CTF. Like when you start working on it, when you find something, you don't believe it. You're like, okay, maybe it's just there to fool you. It won't surely work. Okay, so we did a port scan on the MySQL database, and there it was. It was just accessible from the internet. So we found port 3606 open, which it's a MySQL database. And even at this point in time, I didn't believe. I'm like, okay, it's out there, but maybe the credentials don't work or they're outdated. But no, they worked. So right from your basement, you're able to connect to it. Now you've got all this data. So again, everything is redacted. I don't know. I tried to keep data, whatever made sense. So if you look at the column names, there's patient code. There's another patient code, then first name of the patient, then there's last name of the patient, patient date of birth, gender of the patient, and there was some more data associated with the patient. Right? So we were able to pull a lot of data from the database using this database. So other interesting table that we came across was it contained the login for the portal itself. So it stored the username, the email, password in plain text, and then roll code, which basically tells you if you're a doctor, if you're a manufacturer, if you're a patient, a pharmacist, etc. So we pulled out some of the credentials for the manufacturers themselves and then used that to log on to the portal. And here again, it's all redacted, but you can see that we were able to pull out tons of resident names, unit, maybe where they were staying at the hospital, room number, home address, and SCN, which is basically the healthcare number for those particular patients. So like, again, tons of data, healthcare data. And then finally, we were also able to pull out the actual prescriptions that doctors wrote. So these were digitally sent to the pharmacies, but we were able to pull it out. And the beauty of all of it was that, so when I started doing this assessment, I looked at this digital pen. I'm like, this doesn't do much. In the best case scenario, I'll be able to sniff some data or like get a couple of prescriptions out of there. But since using these credentials, since we directly went to the database and completely bypassed the presentation layer, which is the portal, which might have some segregation, now you're directly on the back end, you can pull out all this data. So we were able to view data from all the medical institutions and healthcare institutions where this pen was deployed, but not just where our test pen was deployed. So that was tons of medical data. To sum it up quickly, we got access to digital pen. Like they're really tiny, so if hospitals allow people to freely walk into the hospital, unlike corporations. So they are usually just exposed on the nurse's desk. So if someone wanted, they could just pocket one because it doesn't really have to be connected to that whole setup to exploit this vulnerability. And then a bit of reverse engineering would allow you to decrypt that configuration file, which gives you access to the database, and then all the data could be accessed remotely. Let's jump onto the second case study. And this was an IV infusion pump that we looked at. And infusion pumps are used to inject medicine, fluids, nutrients in a controlled manner into a patient using a catheter, which is basically placed under a patient's skin. It's got some security features built into it. So, for example, you can set soft and hard limits. So as a doctor, I can set morphine limit to be 100 milligrams. And so even if patient wanted to pump more morphine into their body, they won't be able to do that. They're usually standalone devices, but are now connected to the network. Again, these images are completely random. They don't mean anything. And I think that image is just too pretty to be clicked by me in a lab setup. Right, so again, I've tried to create a workflow. So Infusion Pump was again connected to the hospital infrastructure using wireless. It constantly spoke with the pump server. So pump server is something that stores and then caters to configuration. So to an infusion pump. So your patient name, the drug for that patient, how much dosage, at what time, so on and so forth. And then that, again, so manufacturers usually have access to these devices through hospitals' VPN, so they can connect it remotely and troubleshoot it. Like I mentioned, most of these devices are heavily maintained by manufacturers' own technicians and not by the hospital staff. Right, so to start with, the setup in lab was just this infusion pump. So it wasn't connected to the network. It didn't have any real-world data. So nothing in there, just that pump sitting on a desk in the lab. So we made some initial observations. So it had capability to connect over Ethernet, had capability to connect over wireless. It exposed a couple of USB ports. It also exposed an IRDA, which is infrared device association port. It had a touchscreen display, a small keypad, and then we noticed that there was a maintenance mode, but it required password. So as soon as we saw that there is a maintenance mode, we started to Google if there is a default password which is out there. We tried to locate manuals, help forums, etc. And so we eventually found the default password, and obviously it worked because no one changes the password on these things. It's one of the most common issues. And so So when we got the password, we were able to obviously gain access to the maintenance mode. It allowed access to a lot of network configurations. We could change some of the configurations, but not all of them. We also had an option to upgrade or downgrade firmware, but I'm not that technical, so it didn't go that route. We also noticed that there is an IRDA interface. So since, like I said, it wasn't connected to our lab network, so our next goal was to connect this device to our lab network. And so we tried to spin up our own rogue wireless access point because we saw that it's trying to connect to a wireless access point, but it's not there. So we spun up our own rogue access point without any security settings, and it refused to connect to it. So I think it only connects to an access point with the same name, which has WPA or WPA2 enabled. So okay, so we reconfigured our rogue access point with the WPA, and then it tried to reach out to it again, and it didn't connect again. And I think the problem was because it came pre-configured with a username and password, which we didn't know. So we sort of hit the dead end there. So that didn't work. We didn't even see an option to change the username and password. So like we initially noticed that it has an IRDA interface, so we started to look for other devices that are out there that supports infrared, right? And so eBay is the gift that never stops giving, so you can find anything on eBay. So we found this PDA, handspring visor, platinum, sounds like a resort. So we found this PDA on eBay. It also had infrared capabilities. So the idea was to get the PDA and Infusion Pump to talk to each other over infrared. So we bought this device for I think $10-12. Brought it back to our lab network, and so what happened was, since we were not able to copy the configuration from the Infusion Pump to our PDA, we saw that there is an option to export network settings through the maintenance mode, right? So we were able to interface our PDA with the Infusion Pump with no problems at all. There was no authentication there. And so we chose the export option, and so it exported all the network settings to our PDA over infrared. And so that was saved in the Notes app of the PDA. So we were really excited about it. So we opened up the app, looked at the network settings, and there was nothing in there. So I think someone on the manufacturer side figured out that it's generally a bad idea to export these settings to a foreign device, so they blocked it. So that's really good of them. So all we received was a blank template. There was no data in there that could be used. So we were a bit disheartened, but we did what you do to a template. We filled it. We took all the settings from our rogue wireless access point and filled the template with all those settings. So we put up the wireless access point name, our own username and password, security settings, WPA, WPA2, etc. And once we did complete the whole template, and it was a pain to type it in there, but when it was all done, we attempted to beam it back to the Infusion Pump over IRDA. And that worked. So we never thought that would work. It was just done out of boredom. So instead of taking their configuration to our device, we configured our device and then took that configuration and cloned it onto the Infusion Pump. And it overwrote all the wireless settings and network settings of the Infusion Pump from the PDA. So now we were all good. So now at this point of time, it just simply connected to our Infusion Pump, and that worked. So now we had this Infusion Pump connected to our lab network. Right, so made some more observations. Once that was done, we noticed that it exposes Telnet, FTP, SSH. We tried to brute force into these services. That didn't work, but I think that just means that we need to buy better word lists. We also noticed that when connected to the lab network, the Infusion Pump tried to reach out to a server. So it was trying to resolve a NetBIOS name, which wasn't there. So we figured that because Infusion Pumps usually talk to the pump server, so it's talking to the pump server. And so at this point of time, we didn't have a pump server on our lab network, so we just spun up a virtual machine, gave it the same NetBIOS name that pump was trying to resolve, and then just put it up on the network. And once that was done, we instantly saw, so we also installed Wireshark on it. to capture network traffic. And so as that happened, we saw that the Infusion Pump, the pump instantly tried to reach out to the pump server. Now it could resolve the name of the pump server, so it started sending some packets to it. So we put Netcat utility on that pump, on our fake pump server, and then so it started to listen on that TCP port 11111, which is the same port that pump was trying to reach out to. So we started receiving some packets. This is what an initial packet looked like. Again, it looked like a proprietary protocol, but it was loosely based on XML. So we were able to decipher the data that was coming from the pump. So we saw that it contained certain information like pump serial number, current time, wireless access point, MAC information, maintenance due date. And then at the end of the packet, there was a checksum. But since it was a simple XModem checksum, it could easily be spoofed. So all that redacted information is that information. Right. So after doing so back and forth, we tried to understand the request format, what the format of the response would be. Now remember, we didn't have an actual pump server on our network, so we don't really know what the request response would look like. So we started to write a Python code because it's always easy to automate stuff and then try out a different input-output. So that's what we did. We did a lot of back forth, but after a while we started to understand the format of the packets that were coming and the kind of response it was expecting. So we noticed that we identified a numeric error in the request, and then after a few hours we figured out that it relates to certain message types that it was expecting, right? So we deciphered several message types. There could be more. We aren't really sure. But there was a message type 2, which confirms to the pump that it is now connected to the pump server. So when I receive an initial request from the Infusion Pump, my fake server would send back a message type 2 and tell the server that, okay, you are now connected to a pump server. And once that happens, the Infusion Pump starts to send more verbose information. So we started getting more information from the Infusion Pump. Message type 7 and 31, we're really not sure about. We're still looking into it. Message type 8 was typically followed by a message type 2. And so when we sent a message type 8 after a message type 2, it changed the status of the pump from none to receiving. So it was ready to receive more data from the pump. Message type 20 was something to do with network commands, and then message type 208 and 238, we're again looking into it. We're not really sure. But through a lot of fuzzing, since we were able to send packets that were able to retrieve more information from the Infusion Pump, we were able to. This was the winning packet. After sending message type 2 and then message type 8, we were able to retrieve this information. And so here you can see I've highlighted some of it and then redacted the rest of it. So you can see the drug information, the dosage information. There's a care area, caregiver, patient data, location, route, site, etc. And you will see that all these tags are empty here because we didn't have real-world data in the lab environment. But in a real-world environment, we will be able to pull all that data from the Infusion Pump and also send it back. So we could possibly override this data and then send it back to the Infusion Pump. We were also able to gain access to master drug list. Master drug list is a drug list on an Infusion Pump which contains information such as your patient name. So what patient will get what medicine in what dosage, at what intervals, so on and so forth. So we were able to get access to that, and then could possibly also override soft and hard limits. So these were the vulnerabilities and findings we had from the research. On closing remarks note, I would say that a lot of these devices are coming out, and the problem is that these devices are being manufactured and rolled out first, and then they're thinking about the security. So just like any other product, security needs to be built into it rather than bolting onto them at a later stage. Medical institutions will have tons of new connected devices connecting to their network, and so they should really come out with a framework. The people more intelligent than I am should work on a framework that will allow these devices to securely connect to a network, and they shouldn't really trust any device until they are able to establish the trust with that particular device. FDA is doing a lot of good work. They're pushing a lot of manufacturers to implement security into their product. They're working on standards and regulations, so that's really good. But we also need to go beyond standards and regulations, because as we have seen in past that they do the bare minimum, and then and once you go beyond these regulations, you should be able to achieve more security into the product. Guys, like, we can learn from the past mistake. These are not the new vulnerabilities that anyone is discovering. So everything that has come out, it's like some form of already existing vulnerability. So default password, passwords in firmware, unencrypted data, insufficient authentic authorization. So we have a lot of history to look at and to learn from. Finally, either manufacturers should get an assessment, security assessment done on their medical devices. Best would be right from the designing phase. But if manufacturers are not getting that done, if you think that manufacturers are lazy, then medical institutions should push their manufacturers to get it done or ask for a security report when they buy the product from them. And that's very much it from my side. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Any questions? So I've put my contact details in there. There's an email ID for Spirent Security Lab. So if you have any queries, there's Twitter ID in there. If you are an introvert like I am, so if you don't want to ask questions here, you can reach out to me later, and then we can talk about it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when you work with the manufacturers, what kind of remediation need of these cases?
All right, so we got a very good response from the manufacturers, and then the issues were fixed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Really? So
Yeah.
it was like you gave them a line item?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Have you ever digging into the firmware of these kind of devices?
Actually, we are still working on the firmware, and then there are other medical devices that we're looking at right now. So there's like an ongoing research. And so, yeah, so from firmware, again, we didn't talk about the firmware issues because we were able to retrieve default passwords, hard-coded passwords from the firmware, which is nothing new. So we didn't want to talk about it, but we're looking at other issues. There are possible ways to pass the firmware and bypass the check on the firmware. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for the great presentation. I'm curious, what type of encryption was used in your case study number 1 for the...
It was a proprietary encryption protocol. So that's why we had to reverse engineer the logic of the encryption and then reverse. So it was all reversible, so it wasn't anything fancy, but it was proprietary encryption.
Okay, no crypto keys or something like this?
Yeah, the key was also stored in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So static keys.
So it had, so the logic, so we found the code, we reverse engineered the logic of it, and then we looked for the key which was also in there that was used to encrypt the data.
Okay. Looks like 90s security.
No, actually it looks like very 2016 and 2017.
Anybody else?
All right, thank you everyone again for coming and for your time. Cheers.